you are still here," Aldred observed, when Osrith hadn't left. Instead, she had leaned against the palisade, with her arms folded, and turned her head, nonchalantly, when he spoke. "Yes?" "Oh, yes," she agreed. When he continued to stare at her, Osrith leaned up from the defensive structure and trod casually towards him. "As opposed to leaving, you mean?" The man stared back at her, as she stood in front of him. "Well, you see, I take it you are a keen young fellow, keen to follow the instructions that Steeper gave you, yes?" Osrith did not wait for Aldred to respond. "And, so, I am assuming that, when the Lady Gysla returns to this gate, your instinct will be to challenge her again. And yet, I know, that if you were to give her grief, that the lady will return to her husband, the Lord Utard, and tell him. And, he will come looking for you, the Lord Utard will." Osrith looked over towards Eckard again. "Have you heard of the Lord Utard, Eckard?" The man said nothing, but nodded his head, slowly. "The last time someone upset his wife, Aldred, the man was spitting his teeth out all over the road. And that was for not saying, 'Good morning,' to the Lady Gysla." "Now," she continued, noticing the young man had grown pale, "just imagine what he will do if he finds out you impeded her progress in her legitimate business, Eckard." The man just nodded again, and had grown as pale as Aldred, and it was all Osrith could do to stop herself from exploding into laughter. "So, as I know Steeper needs every single one of youse to guard the city, I'm just going to wait here, and see that the Lady Gysla comes back again, and see that she is not impeded." It was worth it to watch the two young guards sweat it out. It was a matter of moments when a knock came at the gate, but to them, it must have felt like hours. Before the woman had finished banging, the latch was being drawn. Aldred bowed low as she passed. Eckard was looking at his feet. "My lady," Osrith nodded, as she saw the amused look on Gysla's face. "May I escort you back to the palace?" "I am going back to my home," Gysla said, nodding in the direction of the west gate. "You may escort me to the marketplace." So Osrith walked with her sister-in-law the few minutes to the square where stalls were already being set up, and she asked after Gysla's health and the health of her daughter and son. "We are all quite well," Gysla agreed, gripping a wrap of cloth in her hand. Osrith noticed. "I will report them to Steeper," Osrith said, but this drew Gysla to a halt and she looked at Osrith intently. "I needed to visit the Britons for my own needs," she said, her voice low. "Though my husband accepts I need help beyond Christian medicine," she added, "if he believes I have gone for myself, he may worry unnecessarily." The look on her face, brow wrinkled and creasing at her eyes, matched her worried tone, and Osrith laid a hand on her forearm. "I will say nothing," Osrith said, then saw a look of realization pass behind Gysla's eyes. "I went there for similar reasons." But, it wasn't that which Gysla meant, and she bent her head towards Osrith. "I know you ... I think." "Yes ... I think I do." "And are you, Lady Gysla, sister of King Guthard, wife of Lord Utard?" Osrith replied, silently, in her own head. "I am sister-in-law to you twice over." "At the palace, my lady, I am a guard, a warrior." "A woman warrior," Gysla mused, her voice louder as the conversation became much more legitimate again. "We have had many in my own country." "Few here, in the Saxon lands." "Many in Irion," Osrith noted. "And this is whence you come?" Gysla asked. "Irion, amongst other places," she replied, opaquely. "I am Lackland. I earn my living by my sword." "But yes, women warriors are more common in Irion and Alba." "And you like to fight?" Gysla asked, as they began walking again. The market was just in view, and already traders were getting their boards raised up and flat, ready to fill with goods, food, meat, ironware, everything needed to run a city. "I grew to it," Osrith replied, truthfully. "I became good at it." "I would not make a good wife nor a good mother." She looked at Gysla's stomach. "Does your baby come soon?" she added, glad to be able to change the subject. "Within the next month, probably within the next 2 weeks. He wriggles so," she added, laughing lightly. "My thanks, Captain Osrith," Osrith replied, then nodded to the lady. before striding off briskly towards the palace. Enough time to get some food into her, while talking with Elfrith before the day's training. 88,888,888. And it had been a tough training that day. Osrith had taken herself away for half an hour before supper to imbibe the lily root she had bought, wondering if she should have taken the willow bark as well. Not that she needed the tansy, she had no intention of being with a man. Her work as a captain was going well, and Osrith felt that if she never saw a man again like that it would suit her well. As she sipped the broth, she overheard Steeper speaking to Elfrith, and made herself known in the armory. "We are to march north, to challenge the Danes," Steeper told her. "They have attacked Alton, north of here. We move tomorrow, so you should make ready." And from him, Osrith learned that Heston was leading men, once commanded by Eric and Siegfried, and another Dane, there was always another Dane, by the name of Sigurd Bloodare was impinging into East Anglia. "Does the Lord Ethliad come, then?" Osrith clarified. For they were, technically, his guard, not Steeper's to command, directly. The big man inclined his head towards her, and nodded. Osrith's heart glowed as she heard that, another opportunity to lead her men in victory, to have them fight for their beloved Mercia, and she put her hand to the Thor's hammer at her neck, one she had used to perfect her disguise when going about her subterfuge at Beamflout, though she wore no cross, wondering again why it was she kept it. Taking it off had felt like a loss, and it was a constant reminder, when she was called out as a woman by the West Saxon men as part of the practicing the battle drills, that she had achieved something. Her men round her reminded Osrith of that, too, and thought at how quickly the Thurgilsons had been replaced, like water from a hole in the sand on a beach. Remove what is there and more comes flooding in to replace it. She caught up with Elfrith, and told him she needed the men in the training ground that night, and spoke to them, briefly, that they would be fighting in Wessex and to be prepared for they would be likely marching at dawn, and Osrith was gratified to see that not one of them, not even Elfkin, shrunk from her words. Indeed, after she had announced that the alehouse was where they would repair, while waiting for further instructions, and the men were positively exuberant at marching out, Osrith stood them drinks, 3 milks and 3 ales, and they found seats near the door, entertaining themselves with their usual, guess the next man in game, which was very silly, and involved in trying to guess whether the man would be fair or dark-haired, tall or short, stocky, or thin, and so on, and resulted in laughter as they argued their point. It was innocuous until Steeper came in. The head of Alfred's guard had his attention drawn to Osrith and her men when raucous laughter came from their table. Leofstan, who was already laughing about a comment Falkberg had said 3 people ago, laughed again when Ossier added, "Very tall," and Egelfrith continued with, "Cloud Bruiser," both of the younger men grasping control of themselves as Steeper strode over to them. "Captain Osrith, you are to report to the king," he told her, eyeing the Mercian warriors again. Immediately, Osrith made to get up, but he stayed his hand. "Finish your drink, with your ... men." His eye caught Leofstan's for a brief moment. "The king is at prayer, come after the prayer bell has rung." "Understood," Osrith replied, as her heart soared with the anticipated instructions, and she waited for Steeper to turn, which he did so, before turning back to them, as a poorly disguised hitter drew his attention. "Good evening," he added, when he couldn't work out what the joke was, or even, who to challenge over it. The door pushed open and more men came in, Utad, with his warriors, and 1 or 2 more of the Wessex guards, Aldred and Eckard with them. "Cloud Bruiser," Ossier repeated the comment, beginning to laugh again, but Egelfrith nudged him, as Utad surveyed the pub, and noted them. "Not him," Egelfrith corrected his friend, "not tall." "Thor lover?" Osrith gripped his shoulder, forcefully. "Du indubule, idiot!" she shouted, pushing him back, and growling by his ear, hissed, "We all need you tomorrow, understand? I do not want him to give you back to me in pieces, understand?" Egelfrith nodded, and Osrith let him go. Elfrith picked up her milk pot and sniffed it. "No, just goat's milk," he said, grinning, and Osrith relaxed, and smiled. giving them all permission to laugh as her deputy broke the tension. Then, he pointed over to the door, which was propped open now by two more West Saxons, as two maids from the palace walked by. "And, if they came in, Oshir, what would you say then?" This made the young man blush, and he took up his ale, and they laughed again, and they talked about the women in the palace, as the older men teased the younger men. Elfrith held up his hands, defensively, whenever the subject of boasting about women came up, protesting that Ethel, his wife, would find out. "But, no harm in looking," he commented, and Osrith realized that she had been glancing over to Utad's table. Finan caught her eye, and she looked over to Falkbald, who was chatting quietly to Leofstan. "No harm," Leofstan agreed, his own eye on Steeper, who had gone to join Utad, sitting with his ale pot next to Citric, "but not for you, Captain." Falkberg nodded towards the two women, who were standing on a balcony, showing themselves to begin their night's work. "Not at all," Osrith said, firmly. "You do keep looking at the table over there, where Lord Utad is sitting," Elfrith teased. "You realize he is married." "Yes, he was married before, was he not, Elfrith, when we had to guard the woman he threw over?" Her deputy fell silent. She hadn't meant to be sharp, but she felt a hot guilt on her face. She had been looking at Finan, and she wished now that she had managed to keep her feelings to herself. "And I met his wife this morning, as those two," she pointed out Aldred and Eckard, "were making life difficult for her." She picked up her milk, and shrugged. "If I married I could not fight. Life does not allow for that, not here, anyway." "Women fight where you're from?" Falkberg asked, putting down his ale pot, hoping that she would stand another round. Osrith nodded to Leofstan, and handed him a silver coin, feeling generous. "Go and get them," she said, and stood aside so the younger men could approach the bar. "Women can die by a sword, so she learns to defend herself," she said, quietly to Elfrith. "Many women, ferocious Aryan women, fought north there, and were successful. Better to fight than to be raped and die. Better to fight than to die in childbirth. Believe me, I would make a poor wife and mother. I make a better warrior." And, she sipped her milk again, as Oshir approached the table and took up her pot. "I've got to report to the king tonight, for orders." "I can fight, at least." "You can," Elfrith agreed. "We all saw you. You are as good as any man I have known, better than many, I think." But, whatever Elfrith thought, Osrith never found out, as a shout went up to the bar. Steeper was leaning over Falkberg, trying to get at Leofstan, spilling their drinks onto the earth and straw as he tried. "He has done nothing, Steeper," Osrith exclaimed, hurrying over. The head of Alfred's guard looked to her, and loosed Leofstan's jerkin. He nodded, once, and stood back, and 5 fixed-faced men went with her back to the table, Elfrith staring at them. "Did you say anything?" Osrith asked, warningly. Leofstan shook his head. "No, Captain, he did not," Falkberg replied. And then Elfkin spoke. "It was me." I repeated the joke. "The joke?" Osrith asked, and Elfkin's face fell. "What Egelfrith said," he replied, and Osrith sighed inwardly. "Cloud Bruiser." It was funny, for about 2 seconds. After that, it was tiresome. But, Elfkin was only a young boy, and that was the funniest it got for someone who was 12. And he found it funny, did he? Steeper. Elfkin shook his head. "Drink your milk, then," she urged, and they talked quietly amongst themselves, about battle in the northern part of Wessex, and the two women, who were now hanging over the balcony, trying to get the attention of the men. Oshir grinned at one of them, and Egelfrith laughed, before saying one name to him, Ekberg. Then, as Osrith stood yet another round, which Elfrith and Falkberg went to collect, she noticed a man leaning down towards Aldred, looking at Osrith, then grinned. They were not discreet about it, and hadn't meant to be. It was an insult to her, directly. Worse, however, Leofstan saw it, and got to his feet immediately. "No," Osrith urged, but Leofstan pulled from her hand, his chair falling over behind him. "That man was insulting you," Leofstan complained, and Osrith knew that was not tolerated. Captains stood by you, you stood by captains. He was not. Osrith insisted, for Steeper had instinctively stood beside his warriors, glancing down to Aldred, who was still grinning a little at the corners of his mouth. He was, said a voice beside Steeper, a sing-song voice belonging to the man who had just bent over to Aldred and whispered to him, Ethelwold. Osrith's heart sank. He said that while you may be able to tell him what to do in a morning, if it were night, it would be him doing the telling. Silence exploded for a moment, then Finan put his arm on his friend's arm, but Uhtred pulled away as Osrith said to Elfrith, the Lady Gisela. The Lady Gisela what? Uhtred demanded, but Osrith did not reply. Instead she pulled Leofstan back as Aldred pushed back his own chair and got up, standing beside Steeper. Osrith's heart fell as Steeper trod towards Leofstan, standing with his arms folded beside him. This man insulted her. Osrith snapped the qualifying information to her brother as Shay urged Falkberg to his feet. Leofstan! She yelled, as her oldest warrior barreled across the pub's floor, striking Aldred in the face as he launched himself at Steeper. Behind him, Uhtred glanced at Osrith, before stepping past the two fighting men, to haul Aldred to his feet. Can you help? Osrith screamed at Uhtred's men, as Falkberg pulled back Leofstan's fist, only for it to swing into his own face. Steeper was, to be fair, not on the offensive, and where he was fighting he was defending himself. Steeper, big man! Finan shouted, as he and Falkberg took an arm each of Leofstan, and pulled him back, dodging as he nearly got a punch to his temple. Elfrith dragged Leofstan off him, and pushed him in the direction of Osrith's company, and her heart sank as she saw Ethelwold, back to the wall of the pub and leaning nonchalantly on it, arms folded. This ends, Osrith declared, standing between Leofstan and Steeper again, holding a hand, palm towards each man. Are we not going to fight the bastard Danes tomorrow? Don't let them win by killing one another tonight. Then, she turned to her men. Come on, she urged, as Oshir took some more sips of his milk, some of it spilling as Egelfrith pulled at his friend's arm. Come on, Osrith urged, as the evening bell signaling prayer's end filled the air around the chapel. Leofstan! What did I tell you? None of her men answered her, and Osrith leaned over to Elfrith. I have to go to the king's meeting now. Get him back. She looked at the intoxicated Leofstan. Get them all back, Elfrith, and I will talk to him in the morning. And watched her warriors walk, stagger, lope, towards the guardroom, and sighed. She hoped the king would not take too long, and touched her cheek, which had been bruised when she had intervened between Leofstan and Steeper. 88,888,888. But, to her surprise, Steeper was standing before the palace guards on the outside of the throne room's doors, a bruise to his own face far worse than Osrith's. If that is what Leofstan can do when he was drunk, she told herself, then these Danes ravaging Alton would not know what was coming. Osrith, Steeper acknowledged, but shook his head and raised a hand when Osrith tried to speak to him about her elder warrior. It is nothing, compared to what we do tomorrow, Steeper said, ominously, and suddenly Osrith's mind was taken to a time, nearly a year ago, when she had been summoned to speak to Alfred about her rescue of the person everyone presumed was Edward. There will be war, Steeper added, as they waited for the door to open. Mercia will be there, Osrith added, brightly, and realized clearly for the first time, she would be at war with her men again. But, she would have to deal with them first. Leofstan must know he couldn't get away with it, no matter if even he thought Steeper might have provoked him. I have dealt with Aldred, Steeper added, as they waited. Although Lord Uhtred taught him his own displeasure. Osrith set her jaw and nodded, grimly. She had not wanted Uhtred to know, but she knew he would have demanded it of her if she had not said it out as she had done, and this would have allowed her men time to fight with Aldred, and Leofstan with Steeper. And then the door opened. Late summer meant that it was now growing dark, and the king sat in the middle of the hall, candles all around him, giving the impression he was raised up in the light, the most important man in the room. Around them, there were a lot of men there, all leaders of companies, and Osric looked back to the king again, seeing for the first time how ill Alfred looked. "I have called you here because there has been an incursion into Wessex, at a place called Alton, and thereby broken the peace. A great hidden army, it has been called." Osric watched as Alfred moved his head from one captain to another. "I will not be driven back to the marshes. We are stronger than that. Mercia is coming from the north, and we to the south." Then Steeper was called to his side, and he detailed the plan for them, that they were to leave at sunrise to march to Alton, and with Mercia, take and refortify the walls. Then, Steeper dismissed the captains, but placed a hand on Osric's shoulder when she turned. He nodded in the direction of King Alfred. "I understand an altercation took place at the Two Cranes this evening?" Osric bowed her head a little. "Your Grace." She stood back up, continuing. "It was a misunderstanding, I do believe, between the Lord Utard and a warrior in the Wessex army." "Indeed?" "It was news to him." "No," he said, deliberately, "the one which took place between the head of my household guard and one of your men." Osric looked across for a moment to Steeper's impassive face. "Leofstan, I understand his name to be." Osric felt her heart sink. "It will be resolved, your Grace," Osric promised. "When we have accompanied the Wessex army but the king held up a hand. "Not by you, Osric Lackland," Alfred told her, his face showing a brief flash of pain. "The matter is not your jurisdiction, your Grace," she exclaimed, but Alfred held up his hand again. "You are not, and never were, Merson. I sent you there for training only. You swore to me, and to the Etheling, a prior oath." "My company!" Osric exclaimed again, as the king's words swam past Osric's head, and she listened to them in her immediate memory as an anger kindled in her stomach. Had he not ordered her to be taken her over to the border of Mercia by Steeper, expelled from the kingdom like a criminal? Was he trying to do so again? Well, she was Ethelred's guard, not Alfred's. And what did he mean? Prior oath. Beside him, she saw a figure shift, and Bicca looked at her severely. "As for your company," Alfred spoke low and steadily, not taking his eyes off Osric, "I have appointed your deputy, Elfrith, to take charge of the Lord Ethelred's men with the Wessex men." Besides Steeper, Osric realized that Elfrith stood there, and Steeper brought him forward, praised him for his loyalty with the Lord Offa, and asked whether Elfrith freely gave his oath, by proxy, in the circumstance of the absence of the Lord Ethelred. Elfrith did, and he knelt to the king. As he got up, Osric saw Elfrith's face. He wanted to look pleased, he did look pleased, but he knew what it meant to her, to lose the men she had trained, whose loyalty she had earned. And Bicca? Had he had a hand in this? To tell the king, or advise she should no longer be in the army? Osric kept her eyes fixed forward, until the king waved her to him. "My son still requires a guard," Alfred continued, "until his marriage." Osric nodded again, confusion in her mind. Was Edward not already married? Had he not become a father? But it was the Lady Elswith who interjected with additional information. "He is to marry the daughter of Lord Ethelm," the lady explained. Ethelm, Osric thought, dully, rewarded for his wealth with more wealth, having been given the Lord Odda's confiscated lands. "He has said he will only accept you, as you guarded him before." "Your Grace, I will not lead my company, I will not defend my lord." Osric sounded pitiful, and she knew it. But she wanted to make sure that it had been said. "You will not, if you believe your lord to be Lord Ethelred." Alfred's words were heavy. "I knelt to him, and swore to him. I believed you to be discharging me from my oath, and now you know you are mistaken," Alfred replied. "The Lord Ethelred will understand that I have your prior word." It was useless, and everyone in the throne room knew it. "Your Grace," Osric conceded, refusing to take her eyes off the king. "And what is my other choice? Rather than guarding my son, you mean?" A little play of amusement enlivened the corners of his lips. "Cleaning the stables, tending the pigs, they are valuable, of course, and the latrines." "I'll take the livestock," Osric replied, then nodded her head, acquiescently, then dropped to her knees, bending her head. Canny. This king really was canny, head intelligent, and Osric had been caught in it, again. I accept your reinstatement, Osrith Lackland. You have until the army leave to hand over your duties to the most excellent new captain of your company. 88,888,888. Once out of the throne room, Osrith ran to catch up with Elfrith. She saw the look on his face, and waved her arm towards him. I am angry. I am, Osrith agreed, when Elfrith told her he was sorry for the situation, and for a misunderstanding in the fine print of my exile, she added, caustically. Then, her face softened. Apart from Elfgar, I would not have the men left in better hands, Elfrith, and pulled him closer to clap him on the back. Then, they made their way to the armory and talked about the men, who was best placed, which of them needed what support, who could hold ground, who needed a different strategy. And Osrith was pleased to find that Elfrith broadly agreed with her. Elfkin, keep him fed, he will grow. Elfrith nodded as she spoke to them. Falkberg needs instructory and Leofstan can lead the initiative, and Oshir is growing in his confidence and will learn a lot from Leofstan. Osrith, I know, Elfrith said to her, eventually, when she had begun to repeat herself, I know you have to tell me, but, I do know. Osrith stopped, and nodded her head silently, before making their way to the stables, to where the men slept. Can you tell Miral, if he is there? And Aldhelm? I will, Elfrith assured her. They will be confident that you would not willingly have given up the company. So, I want to hear that they have all returned, then, Osrith added, determined to get the last word in. A cold breeze, hinting of autumn, tousled little bits of her hair as they crossed the courtyard. At least Ethel does not need to move again, to a different palace, she added. Elfrith grinned, and then they went to break it to the men. Leofstan, Falkberg, Osrith called, who were talking quietly at the back of the upper sleeping mezzanine, and Elfrith woke Egelfrith, Oshir and Elfkin. Osrith's men formed an arc around her, but were astonished when Osrith fell to her knees before them. In front of her, little Elfkin dropped to his knees, too. Elfkin, she said, taking his hands. I thank you for my life. Back there at Beamflout, she began, and looked into his little sparkling chestnut eyes. I know that I have done a good job with you all because you acted with courage, and intelligence, and, Osrith took his shoulders in both hands, you will make a fine warrior. Then, she got to her feet. And, I mean that for all of you. She looked at their astonished faces. King Alfred, in his wisdom, has ordered me to my old role. In my place, he had given you. She pushed Elfrith towards them, and smiled what she hoped was a reassuring smile, your deputy. All eyes were fixed on him, and Osrith knew then that they all would be all right. I will see you all when you get back, and I want to hear all about your victories. And then, the men were smiling, and Osrith was gratified that they were accepting this last-minute, vital change to their leadership. She stood back, and gave her men one last scrutinous eye. It has been a joy and an honor, to fight beside each and every one of you. All of you can stand beside the men of Mercia and fight, with your heads held high. And one last look, before she said something which would be shameful for a leader to say, about defying the king, and joining her, outlawed. They had done nothing at all to be tempted to buy her. It has been nothing short of an honor to be your captain. And they cheered her. Osrith would long remember the roar of her men, who she had led, and was proud of, but never really knew how they had really felt of her as their leader. She knew now. Now rest, Osrith said, her last order for her company of warriors, knowing that if she did not go, she would never go, and would give in to the temptation of marching out with them. Anyway, rest, or you will be too tired to butcher those bastard Danes. 88,888,888. Osrith did not want to go to her bed, over at the other side of the city that night. For one thing, it meant she would hear the army leaving, for their route to Alton would pass near her rooms. For another, if she met that little shit Aldred, or even Ethelwald, she might just do something regrettable. She may even track down Bocca and confront him. Instead, she made her way down to the sleeping rooms of the nobles, and round the corner to where Edward slept. It was gone midnight, indeed, It must have been into the early hours of the next morning, for the matin bell was already being sounded. But Osric would not look, and instead, tapped at the door. If she was to guard the Etheling, guard him she would, beginning immediately. It took some time for the door to open, as a sleepy young man, though only a couple of years younger than her, definitely no longer a child now, and he rumpled his pale hair as his nightshirt fell to his ankles. He blinked sleepily at Osric. "Your father has sent me," Osric said, "and I am to guard you again." And Edward's face opened into a sunny smile, despite the hour, and clapped her on the shoulder. "You are most welcome, Osric," he welcomed, holding the door open for her. Edward had definitely grown. His face, easygoing and sunny, matched his character. She peered past him, tentatively, looking for a sign he might have company, but his room seemed empty, as did his bed, which he threw himself into, pulling up the covers. It was most confusing. Unless his wife was in confinement with their children, Uhtred had seen him married to Ecgwin, yet, the Queen had definitely said he was to marry Ethelhelm's daughter. Over there, Edward pointed to a stool on which lay folded a blanket. Osric expressed her thanks, and took it, making for the door to settle down beside it. The one candle by Edward guttered, and Osric turned towards him, and to her surprise, instead of going back to sleep, Edward was sitting up in bed. "I know that you wish to leave with your men," the Etheling said, "and I am sorry for you." "My thanks, Lord Prince," Osric replied, but Edward was now up, and had come to sit next to her on the stone floor, and she shuffled up next to him. "I can't believe how you've grown," she replied, despite her lovely feelings. Edward smiled at her words. "And you are a father? What do you know of it?" Edward jerked back, as if hit by something, and his face flashed darkly for a moment. "Nothing at all," she replied, sorry to have mentioned it. Then she turned away, adding, "If that is all." But Edward did not move. Instead, he put a hand on her shoulder,